The American Civil War was perhaps the bloodiest and darkest conflict of the young United States' brief yet action packed history, where over 600,000 Americans in both the Northern Union and Southern Confederacy lost their lives in a dispute fought between sons and fathers, friends and neighbors, brother against brother. All fought for the difference between slavery and freedom, as well as for political ideologies like sectionalism and nationalism. These and many other intellectual differences that had not been bridged between the North and South since the end of the Revolutionary War would become the sole and root causes of yet another war, a war that would be fought in order to once and for all test the will of the young nation and its citizens to break then mend back together under a much stronger adhesive of equality and unity. But in reality, what did the Civil War and the period that led up to it actually change? Well, what history has demonstrated and showed us is that immense changes occurred to a plethora of categories, but perhaps the most obvious and significant of these changes came from African Americans gaining rights and freedoms as a result of abolition, amendments, Reconstruction, and other legislation after the 1860s and Civil War. The argument on whether slavery was constitutional or morally right became the driving force of diminishing relations between the North and South, of Southern secession, and ultimately the Civil War in the early to mid 1800s. Now, I know it was with the Second Great Awakening, after around 1820, where in the North the idea of slavery was seen officially as morally wrong. This idea would essentially inspire the early abolitionist movements that would start attacking the South for their practice of slavery going into the mid 19th century. William Garrison was a journalist and a very prominent abolitionist during the abolitionist movements stretching from 1830 to 1865. In 1830, he published the Liberator newspaper that would greatly contribute to the movements. Further evidence of the significant effects and changes of the Northern abolitionist movements can be found through the diary of Charlotte Fortin. Fortin was born to a wealthy black family in 1837 in the city of Philadelphia. Through abolitionist movements in the North, Fortin was able to become the first African American woman to teach white children as well as freedmen in South Carolina, as documented in 1864. Now, of course, the achievements of Mrs. Fortin clearly demonstrate how African Americans were given significant rights and freedoms in areas like education, specifically in the North. But I think it is even more important to explain how their lives changed in the South. Even more so than in the North, the lives of African Americans changed drastically after the end of the Civil War brought the 13th Amendment in 1865 and through Reconstruction. The 13th Amendment caused the most significant and important changes for the civil rights of African Americans in the South, as it abolished slavery, allowing for them to be seen as people, as citizens, and not objects. Then, through Reconstruction, Congress passed the 14th Amendment, which provided due process and equal protection for African Americans, while the 15th Amendment would give them the right to vote. Now, although much of this legislation was ignored by much of the South after Reconstruction had ended, it would still remain as the framework for total equality for African Americans over the next century. Jordan Anderson, who was a former slave, even wrote his former master to basically say how even though his life after slavery was hard, that it was still so much better than being a slave, basically emphasizing the significant changes to lifestyle that the abolition of slavery brought. Significant changes during this period was not limited to African Americans, however, as the economy and the technological advancements that came with it would only stand to benefit the country. Although the production of cotton was already a huge economic boost for the South, Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin in 1793 would turn the South into a global trading hotspot. The cotton gin increased the production of cotton by 50 times. This made it so that by 1840, cotton had accounted for more than 50% of exports from the South, which of course made the abolition of slavery a threat to the Southern economy as they relied heavily on slave labor. Western expansion also allowed for ideas and innovations for new technologies, especially following the huge influx of people to California during the gold rush of 1848. Americans quickly realized how much land they had traveled through and discovered, and needed a convenient way to travel back and forth through the country.
It was due to this expansion and this problem that in 1862, the Pacific Railroad Act had chartered a transcontinental railroad to be constructed to connect the East to the West.
In this charter, the Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railroad companies began a 7-year project to connect the railroad from California to Nebraska, ending in 1869 as one of the greatest feats of engineering that the nation had ever constructed. The North itself, however, developed the factory system through the market revolution in the early 19th century that would boost manufacturing and effectively industrialize the North.
Before the events of the Civil War and Reconstruction, the North would try to introduce these factories and manufacturing jobs to the South with little success, as the South still relied heavily on agriculture and plantations.
However, because the South had become so war torn and shattered after the Civil War, the North had to try and industrialize and modernize the South during Reconstruction. This was part of the concept of the New South in order to rebuild the region with railroads as well as more modernized buildings and infrastructure.
Taking all that has been said, do I really think that it's fair to say that a lot has changed during the 19th century?
Yes, it is clear to see that although many problems went unchanged during and after the 19th century, that enough was changed for the good to the rights and freedoms of African Americans, as well as for the technological advancements that finished the legacy of the Revolution and would be a great help in propelling the United States into the modern era.